Hello, I'm Tom Harper.
And I'm Diana Thomas,
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show.
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural, and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
Africa has many moods, many faces, and I love them all. Here, before us, she put on one of her more enchanting displays. We were silent and engrossed for a long time. Suddenly, I felt Sally stir against me, half rising. Ready? I asked her, rising with her. Ben! Her hand closed on my wrist with surprising strength. She was shaking my arm. Ben! Ben! What is it, Sal? I was seized with dread that her earlier mood had returned. Look, Ben, look! Her voice was choked with emotion. What is it, Sal? Are you all right? With one hand, she was shaking my arm. With the other, she was pointing down at the plain below us. Look, Ben, there it is! Sally! I put both arms around her to restrain her. Easy, my dear. Just sit down quietly. Don't be a fool, Ben. I'm perfectly all right. Just look down there. Still holding her securely, I did as she asked. I stared and saw nothing. Do you see it, Ben? No. And then, like the face in a picture puzzle, it was there. It was there as it should have been from the beginning. Can you see it? Sally was trembling. Tell me you can see it too, Ben. Tell me I'm not imagining it. Yes, I mumbled, still not certain. Yes, I think. It's the city of the moon, Ben. The ghost city of the Bushmen. It's our lost city, Ben. It is. It must be.
And those dramatic words come from Wilbur Smith's 1972 book, The Sunbird, which I confess I had somehow missed in all my many years of reading his books, but which turns out to be completely engrossing. And it's a two-part story, and that Tom was there speaking in the voice of the narrator of the first part, Benjamin Kazin, a museum director and archaeologist who is also a hunchback. And this is, I think, fascinating. One of the many fascinating things about the book. So, Tom, perhaps you can set up what it is that Ben and his the girl he loves above all, Sally Benata, are looking at.
Yes, so this is a story, this Sunbird, built around the quest for the legendary city of Ophir, which is first mentioned in the Bible as a sort of legendary city of gold. And it revolves very much around these three characters, Ben and Sally, who you've already mentioned, and then their friend and sponsor, Lauren Stuyvesant, who go into the wilds of Botswana searching for this mythical city because they think they've seen some photographs, or some photographs have come back which show the outlines of what might be this lost city. And the story is very much their quest to find this city and the secrets it holds and the secrets of its destruction.
The thing about this book, I now realize, is that it's actually an incredibly pivotal book, both for Wilbur as a writer, in the sense of it brought him to an entire new audience and a new way of writing, but also because, for all sorts of reasons, it actually foreshadows books that we've been talking about, which are the Egyptian series, the Taita books, because one of the fascinating things about the book is that it's actually two stories in one. You have one kind of archaeological thriller about this discovery and what happens as a consequence of that discovery. And then the second half of the book, which we'll be talking about in a second episode, is about the story of the city itself and how it came to be in the state in which it is found, which is to say, utterly destroyed. And I don't know about you, Tom, but I mean, I just found it riveting.
Yeah, no, like you, this was one that had passed me by until our producer Chris suggested it. And I was absolutely hooked, genuinely reading through it as we prep this episode. And the other thing I thought was very interesting was, as you say, it's a novel of two parts, and I think it sort of captures both sides of Wilbur's writing, because actually, until this is his seventh novel, I think, written in 1971. And to this point, he'd published 6 books, 2 Courtney books, and 4 contemporary thrillers, I think.
Yeah.
And so this is him really fusing those two sides of his career, the historical novels and the contemporary thrillers. But then actually adding a third element, which is sort of this very ancient history, which, as you say, he'd go on to explore in the River God series. So it's really the fulcrum of what he had done and everything he was going to do next, I think.
Yeah, because one kind of forgets, or it's easy to forget that because he's so well known for these great big historical epics, that for aside from Where the Lion Feeds, and most of his books, you say, had been contemporary thrillers. They'd been punchy, relatively short books, easily filmable, and indeed often filmed.
Yeah.
Gold, Shout at the Devil, these sort of set in contemporary South Africa or Southern Africa. I mean, I have to say that this is one of those books. This comes back to the old sensitivity reader thing.
Yeah.
The first half of the book is written in the voice of a guy from from kind of the 60s, 70s turn.
Yeah.
So it is safe to say that your contemporary sensitivity reader would be just having to go and have a quick lie down about every 5 pages, because the attitudes expressed entirely normal for the period. Nobody in 1971 or 72 would have thought there was anything odd about the way in which Ben Kazin talks about women or people of other races, or not by the way that is overtly sexist or racist.
Homosexuals also don't feature well.
Indeed, there's a bit about hairdressers, which I think, in a contemporary context, be felt to be very inappropriate. But I think it's important to bear in mind that that he's writing through a character. This is the character speaking. And
Yeah.
one of the frustrating things for an author is, like, when you speak through a character, you're not talking. The character is talking. So that the way they talk is part of that character. Hello.
Yeah.
And yes, and that his attitudes. He goes girl spotting on the King's Road.
Yes.
I think it'd be considered almost a shooting offence just to even admit that a man liked going to look at girls, or that they were indeed girls rather than independent women. But again, completely normal at the time. So with that caveat to one side.
Yeah, there's another actually on that vein, and this is something I think hopefully we'll discuss later in the show, but there are people online who have accused this novel of being a sort of justification, apologia for white rule over Africans. And again, I think that's not entirely straightforward, but I think that's something we can dig into later in the show.
I think what there certainly is, whether consciously or unconsciously, in both stories, white colonialists are either threatened by or actually overthrown by native populations, indigenous peoples. So
I think the other thing, I think the other piece of context to this novel is when it was written, which, as I say, is sort of, I think, written 70, 71, and came out in 72, yeah. And the first thing that's really surprised me was realizing that it mostly takes place in modern day Botswana.
yeah,
Botswana is a very, very new construct. It only gains independence, I think, in 1965 or 66. So as a country, it's only 4 or 5 years old at this point. And the other country where things happen is in Zimbabwe.
yeah,
But at the time, of course, Zimbabwe is Rhodesia. In 1965, Ian D. Smith has made a unilateral declaration of independence
yeah,
because Britain won't allow the colony of Rhodesia to be independent unless they have majority rule, i.e., universal suffrage for blacks and whites. And rather than accede to this horror, he and his kind of white settler regime declare independence and become a sort of international pariah state
yes.
for what turns out to be 15 years, from 65 to 80. So we're bang in the middle of this. So countries that we now think of as being settled geographical entities at the time of writing are actually either new or don't even exist yet. And there is this very fierce bush war going on in Rhodesia, which becomes part of the plot. So I think this is a book which really you have to understand the context in which it's happening, because it is a world that's not like the world we know now, quite apart from the attitudes.
And of course, South Africa at this point um, is in the sort of depths of
Yeah,
apartheid.
yeah,
So, for example, the fact that that Ben, one of his closest colleagues, Timothy Mageba, is black and is treated kind of as an equal, pretty much.
yeah.
That in itself, to a South African audience of the time, would have been seen by liberals as a very liberal thing, and by pro-apartheid people as a very shocking thing. So
It would probably been enough to get the book banned by the apartheid regime, I'd have thought.
quite, um, it's actually a book he writes about himself as much as any other book in on Leopard Rock, his autobiography. I mean, so it was very much he writes about it very much as a book that is really central to his development as a writer. Give me one moment, and I will be able to tell you exactly what he says about it. So he's writing now about a point during the creation of the books, as Tom says, we're kind of in 1971, and he says, the manuscript in front of me was half complete, but already much bigger than the thrillers that had consumed each of my last few years. Shout at the Devil, Goldmine, and The Diamond Hunters had all been blistering reads, highly charged, with adrenaline-driven plots like the best adventure stories, and they'd been written with an expenditure of enormous emotional energy. The Sunbird was to be something different. The challenge was daunting, but there was no room in my life for artistic ennui, indulgences like writer's block, or appealing to the elusive muse of inspiration. My muse was my father's voice in my ear saying, "Get on with it, Wilbur, you lazy son of a bitch. There's work to be done." The Sunbird was going to be my most ambitious, richly imagined, and unfilmable work to date. The germ of the idea had come from my experience as a boy in Great Zimbabwe, and what the ghosts were telling me as they drifted through the ruin. I was developing my own theory about the history of the place, and imagining my own lost city of Ophir, founded by castaway Carthaginians who had travelled south after suffering the depredations of the Romans in North Africa. They would come through Gibraltar, down an ancient river system now dried up, until they reached the mighty Nile, the birthplace of civilization. I imagined that they'd cross the Namib as I would one day, and in Botswana founded a fantastic civilization, all of it to be undone by a villainous king and rediscovered millennia later. The novel would be a two-part story set millennia apart, and it'd be richer than anything I had written before. So there he is in the midst of having this kind of sea change. And when he's talking about Great Zimbabwe, that's the city which actually exists. It's in the country of Zimbabwe, which is an astonishing stone ruin. One never thinks of Africa as having massive, or sub-Saharan Africa, as having massive stone ruins as one might do of other civilizations. But Great Zimbabwe is as impressive as any Inca or Aztec or other ruin that you might find.
Yeah, I was trying to describe it to my wife the other day, and I was saying it's sort of like the African Machu Picchu, I
Yes,
think.
very good
Um,
comparison. Yes,
and
exactly.
and in fact, we've in a forthcoming episode, we're actually going to have an expert on Great Zimbabwe come and talk to us about it. So listeners who are intrigued, stay tuned.
Because it's also Great Zimbabwe is also appears in a book we've also discussed previously, A Falcon Flies,
Yeah,
where it's stumbled upon by the Ballantines, and indeed the falcon that flies is a stone falcon, which again is a real thing that really was in Zimbabwe, and which it features on the current crest of Zimbabwe, I believe,
yes,
and and is also mentioned in this book. So
yes, and birds are very interesting here because the obviously a falcon flies is named after the falcons in Zimbabwe. The sunbird, there's lots of different sunbirds in this novel. And one of the things that I realized was in the first half of the book, the sunbirds there is an actual bird called a sunbird, which was, I think Wilbur says it's his favorite bird.
Yes.
And he named his house in Cape Town after it. But in the ancient story, the birds they called sunbirds are actually vultures.
Yes, because they fly up towards the sun.
Because they fly up towards the sun, exactly.
And the hero of the second part is also known as Sunbird, isn't he, by his king? Yeah.
He is by his friend, yes. And the hero of the narrator of the first part, Ben Kazin, is also known as the Sunbird by the Bushman tribesmen who he's befriended.
Good point.
So there are sunbirds everywhere in this novel.
That's one of the things about the book that's also interesting, is that each half of the book is in character terms a mirror image of the other.
Yeah.
So,
and I think maybe we can talk about that more when we get to the second half.
Indeed. But now I think we should really get down to the straightforward telling of the story of how it is that the point you describe comes sort of 80 or 90 pages into the book, but it begins with some photographs.
Yes, and it begins with two characters. I think the extraordinary thing about this book is it's absolutely epic and vast on a scale I think that Wilbur hadn't attempted previously, but would obviously become very well known for. But actually, it really the first half, the contemporary thriller part of it, and revolves really around three characters, maybe three and a half characters.
Four, I think, if we're going to be.
Well, we can debate that. The first half of the story, the contemporary thriller part,
probably worth saying four, given that the fourth one is the black one.
But he gets so little page time. I'm going to stick.
Just nervous about okay.
I mean,
he's quite central though. He's central because also he repeats in the.
I honestly don't think you could say that Timothy McGaber is a major character in the first half because he pops up twice but the things he does have no bearing on the plot, really.
I guess.
So the first half of the story, the contemporary thriller part, really revolves around three main characters, maybe three and a half. And it is, as we discover, it becomes a sort of love triangle, but love in different forms. So there are two people whom our hero, Ben Kazin, loves in different ways. And one is Sally, his assistant, his beautiful assistant. And the other is this guy, Lauren Stuyvesant, who is a classic South African industrialist, mining magnate, millionaire, maybe billionaire, who, in current terms, he'd be a billionaire, wouldn't he?
In current terms, he'd definitely be a billionaire.
Who runs this great South African conglomerate and befriended Ben and took him under his wing at Michael House School, which I thought was an interesting detail.
Yes.
Where the Eton of Africa, where Ben was horribly bullied on account of his hunchback.
Wilbur School.
And indeed, yes, as you can see, Diana.
It's Wilbur School. Michael House is Wilbur School.
Yeah, exactly. So again, some quite close identification there between Wilbur and Ben. And it's interesting. We were talking in the episode on Testament about how Taitu was one of the very few characters that Wilbur wrote in the first person, and really was someone who Wilbur clearly, I think, is on record as saying he identified with him most of all his characters. And here we have another of these rare first-person characters, and again, he is he's not the kind of classic hero. He's got this physical disability or deformity, whatever the correct term is. He's described as having a high laugh, a stutter. So he's, in some ways, he's not a kind of classic man in the way that Lauren absolutely is. Lauren is tall, he's broad, he's got a golden aura around him. And the relationship between them kind of reminded me a bit of sort of The Talented Mr. Ripley, where you've got not obviously Ben not being a psychopath, but you've got Dickie Greenleaf, the absolute golden child, the son of tremendous wealth, and then Ripley, who's sort of like his little pet in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, and of course within the Wilbur universe, it's Taita and the gorgeous golden-haired General Tanis.
Yeah.
And one comes back to this fascinating thing that I mean, and Wilbur hated his time at Michael House. I think I'm
Yeah.
right in saying, and as did Ben. And Ben is a really interesting character because he's described as being sort of somewhat simian because he has long arms and long legs and he can move very quickly and he's very strong.
And very, very hairy.
And
Yeah.
he describes himself as simian.
Yeah.
And then he has this hunch and he can play the guitar and sing. And
Very beautifully. I think that's quite important. It's not.
yes,
Yeah.
that's what I was going to say. And that's a sort of Taita thing, and that then also echoes into the second half of the book. But it's just fascinating. And he's Jewish, which again puts him in a minority situation.
Yeah.
So it's just fascinating that once again the character that he feels drawn to speak through is a character who has overcoming tremendous weaknesses rather than someone who is born to great privilege and just as well has things given to them on a plate. And I just found that absolutely fascinating when I was reading it. Why would you? There's no reason really why this story the first half of the story needs to be told in the first person. I mean, it helps in certain respects, but you could have told it just as well in the third person. But no, he at this point when he's writing a book which he says is very, very personal to him. So I guess that's the answer: is that it's driven by something which is personal. He'd visited Great Zimbabwe as a child and been and found it a very kind of fascinating but slightly spooky experience. So it's a deeply, deeply personal story. And then he writes it again. You could just have a bookish, bespectacled, whatever, but no, you're going to make this hero. You're going to really pile disadvantages down upon him,
Mm.
and it's just fascinating that that's where he would. I mean, the thing I did find about him was, and I don't think I'm giving away too much because I think any reader will feel the same thing. So he and Sally, who's very beautiful, he's always been sort of carrying a tremendous torch for her, again like Taita does for the beautiful Lostris, and always thought that she was completely out of his reach because of his disability.
Yes.
And then, to his absolute delight, after as they are discovering the city, they fall in, or he falls in love with her, but it's consummated.
Yeah. She comes to his bed, slightly fortuitously, and it's not entirely clear what's motivated her, I think.
Well, the other thing is that it's fairly apparent, I would say, from like very, very early on, that she is that something is going on
Yes.
that he is just utterly failing to miss,
Yeah.
failing to spot rather.
Yeah.
He's utterly missing and failing to spot. And you're sort of, it's one of these things where you sort of find yourself not quite shouting the books. If it was on TV, you'd be shouting at the Teddy saying, "For goodness sakes, man, look! Isn't it obvious? Look at the two of them together."
Yeah.
So anyway, we should probably get back to the actual plot of the book, which begins with Ben poring over some pictures taken by an aeroplane hired by Lauren, and as they're actually the plane is actually looking for mineral deposits and various other things. It's not looking for an archaeological thing at all, but by happy accident, among the pictures that are taken are some which appear to show the outlines on the ground of old buildings and walls and a possible settlement. And Ben has got this theory he's been trying to prove about the settlement of that part of southern Africa by people from the contemporary Middle East. The Phoenicians had started in Tyre, then they moved to the city of Carthage, and when the city of Carthage was utterly destroyed by the Romans, the book suggests that a few Phoenicians escaped and came down to southern Africa. And so they set off to see. Lauren, as with his usual limitless resources, mounts this great big expedition to go and find this city. Although the African workers who go with them are extremely reluctant. rapidly becomes clear, to go near this site. And they come to the site and they can't find anything and they can't find anything. And then, when everybody else has more or less given up and gone away, Ben and Sally, much like the discovery of the city in A Falcon Flies, are led to their first major discovery by following, as were animals and birds, into the depths of the rock.
It very much echoes Falcon Flies, because in Falcon Flies, it's the honey eater bird that
Yes.
leads them to the city.
And the little Lorax in the fluffy bunny. That has a role to play as well, I think.
That leads them up the cliff earlier on, I think.
That's
That's
right.
right.
Yeah.
But yes, it's the honey eater bird that leads them, or the honey seeker, whatever it was called, leads them to the city.
Honey seeker.
Yeah, yes, right.
Little seeker of sweetness, isn't it?
And here it's the bees, and this is again is one of these wonderful Wilbur details that I think most writers would never occur to. What finally makes the penny drop in Ben's mind is he sees the bees, and then he realizes that there are birds and there are animals, and there must be a source of water somewhere, even though there's allegedly no water around for 200 miles. And the sun catches the stream of pollen coming off the bees as they fly into their nest, and he's able to use that kind of golden stream of dust to work out where the bees are going.
Just a little bee detail. The things you learn from Wilbur Smith books. There are the bees that come back to the nest with pollen, and then there are the bees that come back to the nest with water.
Yes.
I hadn't realized
Yes.
they're a water carrier. I knew that bees carry pollen. That's how plants are fertilized. I had no idea that there were some bees who are water bees and go and get water for the hive.
Yeah, no, I was the same. One of those, and there's the description of the bees going into the hive with the pollen kind of sticky on their back legs. And again, it's one of these suddenly Wilbur in kind of full-on David Attenborough mode.
Absolutely.
But they then use this insight, and as you say, they find a cleft in the rock which hitherto has been invisible to them. And they go inside and they find this cave. And in the cave is, well, there are a couple of extraordinary things. One is a emerald green pool of water, which is what's been giving the bees and the other animals their water, which on subsequent investigation turns out to be almost bottomless. And the other thing is that the cave is filled with Bushman cave paintings, most strikingly a picture of a great white man dressed as a warrior,
with an enormous erect penis.
With an enormous erection, just to be quite clear that he is a powerful man. And Ben and Sally are absolutely convinced that this is some kind of non-native African, someone from the north who has come down and is evidence for Ben's theory of these kind of Phoenicians who've come down to the area.
I mean, at this point, it's worth saying, and it's important to say, that at the time, it's clear that this was already a very contentious issue at the time, that the notion that a civilization in Africa required non-African people to create it is understandably highly controversial and politically charged, and would nowadays, I think, be considered, or we'll talk about this, I'm sure, when we do on an episode about the Great Zimbabwe, but I mean, it's nowadays absolutely dismissed on both historical and political grounds.
Yeah.
But Ben is absolutely convinced of it, and I think Wilbur is too, although it's important to say this is a work of fiction. I mean, it's a fantasy book. It's not intended to be an academic treatise. It's intended to be a work of fiction. So in a work of fiction, if you want to have a city that's created by people from a trading port on the Eastern Mediterranean, or people from Mars, or, like Chariots of the Gods or something, that's a writer's prerogative.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that he compares this huge, supposedly white figure in the book that Ben and Sally, they talk about it, and they compare it with the White Lady of the Brandberg, which is an actual painting. And I was curious about this. If you go and look at pictures of the White Lady of the Brandberg,
which is exactly what I did,
I'm sure you would. I mean, she's not a white lady. There's white in the painting. There are animals that are white. There are little figures that are white. and her legs are white, and part of her head, but not the main skin of her face, is white, but her torso is black.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's clearly the white leggings strike me as something. I don't know. They struck me as a part of her costume more than anything else.
Yeah, I think one of the theories is that she was smeared with white clay, which I think you still see in some African rituals.
Yes, you do. You do.
So, which strikes me as eminently plausible.
Yeah, but what I don't see in that picture, apart from just the physique and the way she runs and everything, I don't in any respect see a white lady.
No.
I see. I mean, and so I just mentioned that in passing because, as far as I'm aware, and I have actually, for other reasons, done quite a study of native art, and you don't see very many white. Well, you don't see white figures at all.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So coming back to the story, they found this cave with the pool and the paintings, and they get Lauren back there to have a look at it. And a couple of odd things happen. Both Lauren and Sally start to have slightly kind of weird, eerie moments. So Lauren stares at the painting and seems to feel some kind of deep kind of communion with the figure shown as this white king. And Sally goes up, so that the cave, we should have said, it's not completely enclosed. There is actually a sort of hole at the top, like the oculus
yes,
of the Pantheon in Rome,
yeah.
which, or
Or the bit in the James Bond villain's lair where they fire the missile out
exactly
of.
that bit. And there's a bit of rock sticking out into this hole, effectively like a diving board, is how I imagined it. And Sally goes up there and she starts walking along it. It's almost as though she's in a trance, about to sort of walk off it and drop to her death in the bottomless pool below. And Ben has to pull her back. So there's slightly weird things going on, which at the moment,
Weird scenes inside the gold mine. First, the doors. From about the same period, actually.
right?
So it's weird scenes inside the gold mine. Yeah.
I think we have weird scenes inside the gold mine later, actually.
Indeed.
We do.
That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah. But at this point, so they found the cave, they found the paintings, they have not yet found the city. This is then when the extract that I read at the beginning happens. So just as they're about to give up for a second time, the moon rises and they realize, and I kind of get the principle of this. I couldn't really explain it in mathematical terms, but the very low light of the rising moon, it just catches the very, very faint remnants of the foundations of the city, and it can only, it's almost like in The Hobbit, where you can only read the map by the light of a certain moon.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, the lower the sun or the moon goes in the sky, the longer the shadows become.
Yeah. So this is, and and this explains why the aircraft at the beginning of the story was able to see it in its photographs, because the light was right and the aircraft was incredibly high. Whereas from any closer and with any more direct light, the things vanish. But the moon reveals the outlines of this lost city, and so that really gets them going. And suddenly we go from Ben and Sally with a tent and a jeep to suddenly Lauren goes full on industrialist and flies in diggers and experts and buildings, and they build an airstrip, and it suddenly goes into massive archaeological dig mode.
I find that bit. I mean, these huge air-conditioned huts are brought in, and goodness knows what else. And you sort of thought, probably thought, way to destroy the site.
Yeah.
So anyway, Lauren is as much as anything driven by the by the thought that where there's a mighty city, there must also be a great treasure, like the, like kind of lost gold of the Incas or something.
Yeah.
Cities of gold in the Amazon forest, jungle.
Yeah, and they find bits of gold, which if I found it, I'd be pretty excited. What's interesting is that Ben is actually slightly underwhelmed, because what he desperately wants to find is he wants to find proof to prove his theory that this was a city founded by Phoenicians, and he finds a few suggestive things, but nothing. But they could all be dismissed as trade goods or later interpolations. Nothing that's really, a slam dunk evidence that this was a Phoenician city.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, and I must say I got confused about how anybody could have got there, because in the story they don't come down the Nile; they come from the west. the Carthaginians sail from Carthage, which is on the north coast of Africa, through the Straits of Gibraltar, down the west coast of Africa, which is he has said, and I haven't had time to check this out, they had already established in real life, established trading routes down into Africa. And then they come across using waterways which no longer exist. Again, I have no idea if this is the case. It must be the case because there are dried up lakes. They come, as it were, from the west all the way across into what is now Botswana.
Botswana. Yeah. Yeah, and the conceit of the book, which actually, funnily enough, although it's 50 years old, speaks very much to kind of current concerns with climate change, is that there used to be a great lake there.
Yes.
And a river that debouched into the sea that was completely navigable by their biremes and triremes, and so they were able to come all the way deep into Botswana and build a sort of maritime city on the shore of this great lake. Which by the time so this is in about 200 BC ish. So, but by the time we get there in 1971 AD, the lake is completely gone.
But that salt pan is there.
Yeah.
I mean, the site of it and the salt pan, where there used to be a great lake, of which there are lots of them all over the world, that's real. So he's put it he's sort of placed it in a real place.
Yeah.
But it's not. But it's an entirely imaginary. This is my point: is that the book is not making any claims about any place, any city, or ruins that actually exist.
No, there's a bit of a sense that, sort of a hint that Great Zimbabwe, is possibly modeled on this by people who've seen it, or possibly they've built the prototype of it that then gets. But he doesn't labor that.
And there's also stuff about terraced fields being great gardens being created in terraced fields, sort of further to the north in what is now Zimbabwe, which act as the kind of larder for the city. They're growing all the food for the city. So and it's said that the terraces actually still exist to this day. There are stone terraces on an actual mountain in Zimbabwe, but they are thought now to be the ruins of mining works rather than of agricultural terraces. It's not like you might find in China or indeed the Andes, where you have terraces built on mountainsides in order to grow rice or whatever, maize or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, actually, at the time that Wilbur was writing, people did think, and perfectly reputable academics thought, that there was evidence of the use of terracing on mountainsides in southern Africa.
Yeah.
As means of growing food.
Yeah. And the extraordinary thing is, as I say, they found the foundations of this city, but there is not one single stone standing, and no rubble.
No.
They find a few columns with these vultures on top of them, and some sun carvings, but that's, in terms of physical remnants, that's it. Also a layer of ash that they excavate surrounding all of the foundations, which sort of, as with the Troy excavations, suggests that the whole thing was kind of burned to the ground.
Yeah. I think, and there's one other thing which is sort of burbling away in the background here. So I mentioned that Ben had a colleague he works with called Timothy Mageba, and Timothy, there are two very distinctive things about him. The first is that he has a sort of second sight. He's been trained by elders of his tribe, and he has the capacity to fall into a trance and sort of speak like an oracle, as it were. And he is very, very unwilling to go near that site because he regards it as being sort of profoundly dangerous.
He has this phrase, this sort of oracular pronouncement that he says very early on, even before they've
right at the beginning of the book.
He says, "An evil to be cleansed from the earth and the minds of men forever," and that's his warning as to what waits in this place.
Exactly. So that's think first. The second thing about him is that he is ostrich-toed, if that's the right phrase.
That is the phrase Wilbur uses, yeah.
Which is to say that there is a cleft between his big toe and his other toes, which kind of cuts deep into his foot, a bit like an ostrich foot, or those Japanese socks you sometimes see where there's a bit for your big toe and then the rest of your feet. So he has this strange cleft in his foot, which is a sort of parallel to and he also says that he suggests to Ben that Ben also actually has a sort of spiritual side to him. He's just not explored it. And the other thing they have that this that Timothy's
Yeah.
cleft foot is a sort of comparable to Ben's hunchback. And it seems like they're kind of great companions and friends, but again, in a trope that will appear actually also in some of Wilbur's more contemporary works later on when he's writing about the kind of race conflicts in South Africa. Tim McGaber actually has a completely different side to his personality. And there's this sort of strange subplot which is worth mentioning now, even though it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact on the first half of the book, but it emerges that Tim is a terrorist.
Yes, it emerges in the most dramatic way when he comes to Ben's house in the middle of the night, says, right, let's jump on the plane to fly out to back to the dig. And then as soon as they get to the airport, a bunch of his terrorist stroke freedom fighter buddies rock up with their machine pistols,
Yeah.
hijack the plane and fly off to, I think they go to Rhodesia, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, they go to North, they kind of go into the bush in what will be,
Yeah, into the bush, yeah.
and very interestingly, given the politics of Africa now, the terrorists are funded by China.
Yeah.
Which of course has basically conducted a form of sort of economic imperialism in Africa, about which people in the West seem to be weirdly, blithely ignorant of or indifferent to, in which essentially great swathes of Africa have been brought, and the natural resources they contain have been brought under Chinese control, essentially because they've been bought and paid for by China. So this is a sort of echo of what is going to happen in
Yeah.
real life.
Yeah. And in fact, I think historically there were two main Zimbabwean black liberation forces. And one was backed by the Russians, and then the other was backed by the Chinese. So again, this is very
Yeah,
historically.
they were tribal. Mugabe is a Shona, and the
That's
other
right.
Nkomo, I think it's called, was Matabele.
Yeah.
And indeed, the very first thing that Mugabe did when he seized power was to go down to Matabele land and just kill as many people as they could find, because to pay back for all the years in which the Matabele had been killing the Shona.
Yeah. And in fact, which does tie into one of the kind of themes or points of the book, which again, I think we can probably get to as we see it plays out.
I mentioned the fact that, and also the other thing that happens is that in the aftermath of his kidnap and his rescue, at first, Ben is suspected of having collaborated with the terrorists and enabled them to do all sorts of things. But there's then a scene in which Ben has befriended a bushman called Chai or Shai, Xhai.
Yeah.
Chai, I should think.
I mean, it's probably like I or something, but
Yes, exactly.
but I'm not going to murder the poor bushman's
Exactly.
language. So
But in any event, this is also so he has befriended him, and then up in Zimbabwe, there's a sort of side detour. The story takes a detour, and Ben is on in a military convoy which is ambushed by Mageba and his people, and Hai is killed. And this drives Ben into an absolute fury, and he literally picks up a machine gun, and because he's so strong in his arms and his legs, and he just charges the guerrillas, brandishing this machine gun in a Clint Eastwood style.
I was thinking Rambo actually that bit because he's got the ammunition belts kind of draped over his shoulders.
Rambo, that's a much better example.
Yeah, and he's holding this absolutely massive gun.
I was actually trying to think of, as I said, Clint Eastwood was much too cool to do something like that. You're quite right. It's absolutely Rambo. And this is a kind of a sidebar, but it's a sidebar that we need to note because it will play out later.
Yes. There are two bits sort of slightly separate in the text. One is where Mageba hijacks the plane and flies it out into the bush. Then he releases Ben and lets him go back. And then slightly later, Ben and Xai are driving again through Rhodesia, as it is. And as you say, they get ambushed by Mageba again and manage to escape. So there are these two encounters, these two violent encounters. I have to say, for me, they were probably the least relevant parts of this first bit of the story. It's hard to see why they're happening, but
We just need to park that thought
yeah,
because he had his reason. He had his reasons, and I think we shouldn't say what those reasons are because that would be something of a spoiler
yeah,
at this point. So that's why it's just like hold that thought. There is a conflict
yeah.
between the central character and someone he has thought of as a friend who is a black African who with whom he then finds himself in conflict.
Uh, Meanwhile, the main action continues to happen at the excavation of the city. So again, there's sort of a series of kind of progress and setbacks, which I guess is probably quite like most archaeological digs. And again, they've got to the point where they think they've found everything they can. They're packing up. They're ready to go. And then Ben looks at a photograph he's taken of the White King painting, and there's this strange little smudged X on it.
Yeah.
And he suddenly realizes that again, this theme of light, angles of light picking out things that are invisible to the naked eye. You realize that the camera flash has actually revealed a anomaly in the wall, and that the painting is actually painted on a false wall in this cave, which has bricked up a doorway. So, as his best friend is at first, they think it actually crossed their mind that they're just like going to drill through this priceless painting. They decide not to do that. Luckily, his friend Lauren is a mining magnate, so brings in his crack mining crew to drill around the painting and then into the chamber beyond. And at this point, Ben is very keen to warn everyone about the dangers of something called Cryptococcus neuromyces.
Yes.
Which is
the curse of Tutankhamun.
Which is indeed the curse of Tutankhamun. And he
it's a microscopic spore. It's a fungal spore.
It's a fungal spore that you find in areas that have been sort of closed up for a long time, like a pharaoh's tomb or indeed a lost city in Africa. And
so next time you discover a lost city, folks,
be careful.
Watch out for the fungal spore because it's an incredibly powerful and indeed fatal hallucinogenic. First, you have an extraordinarily bad trip, and then you're in very severe danger of popping your clogs.
Yeah, the way Ben describes it is the spores create extensive lesions of the lung tissue with hemorrhage, high temperature, and rapidly painful breathing. Then the fungal colonies begin generating wastes, which are absorbed into the blood and carried to the brain and the central nervous system, which act as very virulent neurotoxin and induce hallucination, inflammation of the meninges, severe brain malfunction, similar to the effects of lysergic acid or mescaline.
As I say, it's a very, very bad trip.
And 75% of people who get this die. So as a reader, you're thinking, there is a very good reason I'm being given this information. But it's not immediately apparent because they drill through into the hidden chamber behind the painting. And Ben does a quick test for this horrible fungus, and it is not present.
Well, they wear respirators too, then.
They wear respirators, yeah.
Yeah.
But then Ben does a quick test, and happy days, there is none of this horrible fungus in the hidden chamber. So they're good. They're good. So false alarm. No need to worry about the killer psychedelic fungus. So they've come into this second chamber, and it's filled with vases, effectively, which in turn turned out to be filled with leather scrolls, I guess, like vellum, filled with Phoenician writing.
Yes, and so now Ben's theory has been proved correct because here, in black and white, carefully preserved are these jars, which, as you say, make it clear beyond doubt. And they describe, and the first jars they find are very kind of precise accountants delineations of exactly all the various goods that are flowing to and fro in and out of the city, and it's very, very detailed. So they have an absolutely indisputable, clear picture of what's been going on. This is enough to make Ben kind of a hero of the architectural world, and to have him lauded at the Royal Geographical Society in London. However, what they don't have yet is the thing that Lauren, capitalist, still wants, which is gold. And they do actually find it. The first form in which they find it is in golden scrolls. They've found these jars behind the picture, as Tom was saying, and one of the sort of running things in the book, and I think this is an example of a writer who isn't yet entirely fully developed, is you keep on being told, the characters, oh well, I just missed something there. If only I'd spotted this. And this happens again and again and again. And one of the occasions is that he misses first time around the fact that, as well as all the scrolls that are just vellum and contain lots of writing on them, they get in an archaeologist from England who's a sort of expert in Phoenician writing to decode them. But as well as that, there's another smaller set of incredibly heavy jars. And when these jars are opened, there are scrolls written on incredibly finely beaten gold. So they're permanent. I mean, it's actually a brilliant idea that if you wanted to store a record forever, you would write it onto gold, which doesn't corrode and doesn't corrupt in any way. And here they find something much richer, not just in gold, but in kind of literary terms. And they are the poems and songs of someone writing. Okay, now another name is hard to pronounce. Huy, Huy.
Yeah, Huy.
Who is the kind of close advisor to high priest and close advisor to the king of this city, and he's also a wonderful poet and songwriter, and he's also a hunchback.
Yes, it transpires.
So Ben identifies with him very, very strongly.
Yes. The other thing Ben's identifying with very strongly is in this hall they find an axe, this massive double-bladed axe, and they polish it up and it's in pristine condition. And when Ben picks it up again, he feels some kind of ancient, mysterious, out-of-body experience kind of going through him, and he almost takes someone's head off because he's so entranced by the power of this axe.
Yeah. So Lauren has it when he sees the king. Sally has it gazing down at the pool. Ben has it picking up the axe. And this is all a bit like the terrorist. Park that thought because it's going to be relevant. And thus far, I mean, I'm thinking about it now, although it's completely gripping and works perfectly well in its own right.
Yeah.
If all that this story was this bit, and it ends this section of the book, they do find the treasure.
Yeah, so they find a second hidden door. And it has to be said, Wilbur in On Leopard Rock says very much that he was thinking of H. Rider Haggard when he wrote this book. And I think the White King, very sort of reminiscent of Aisha, she in She. And actually in King Solomon's Mines, at the end of that, they go into the caves. And first of all, they find the kind of beautiful outer cave. It's with stalactites in King Solomon's Mines. It's with the lake here. And then they go in, and what do they find? They find the Tomb of the Kings, and they find the treasury in King Solomon's Mines. And here, behind a hidden door that's sort of carved into the rock. And here again, at the back of the Hall of Records, the one where they found all the vellum scrolls and the golden scrolls, there is another hidden door, which if you push in the right place, opens on a mysterious pivot.
Which Lauren has a sort of intuitive sense of where that right place is.
Yes, he just sort of reaches and feels it instinctively, doesn't he? And behind this door, as you say, are the two final discoveries that they have to make. One is the treasury.
I don't think we should say what the second one is. Should we say what the second one is? Spoiler alert.
I think we should say what the second one is, because the second one is the tombs of the kings.
Okay.
The 47 kings of Ophir.
And okay, and I think also, and what he finds there is right at the back of that, not properly buried, are the bodies of a kind of reddish blonde-haired king and a darker haired figure kneeling above the king who's impaled himself on his own sword. And Ben realizes that these must be Lannon, who I think he already knows his name, doesn't he? The King Lannon.
Yeah, they've got it from the scrolls. Yeah,
and his faithful priest and companion Huy, And there, although this is not quite the last thing that happens, but really would be quite a spoiler alert to say what the absolutely last thing that happens in this section of the book is. But fundamentally, the book ends with the discovery of these two figures in their tomb who've been there. If that was all there was, you've got a sort of 300-page book, which is quite dramatic
Yes.
and has a twist that obviously I've been careful not to reveal what it is at the end, and it would be perfectly serviceable. What makes this Sunbird as a whole incredible is this is only half the book. And it's when you read the second half of the book that the whole thing plays out in full. And that is what makes this a great read in its own right, but
Yeah.
B, just in all sorts of ways, a book that is going to have echoes through stuff that Wilbur writes for the next 30 years.
So they've found pretty much everything the city has to reveal, and it seems as though everything's the happy ending. And then Ben wakes up in the middle of the night, and he is absolutely out of his head. He's convinced he's being attacked. He's convinced everything is on fire, and he realizes that the evil Cryptococcus neuromyces, the curse of Tutankhamun, although they tested the first chamber they discovered, they never tested the treasury and the tomb of the kings. And this terrible, powerful, hallucinogenic, 75% fatal fungus is, as he, in that moment, is growing in his lungs and feeding poisons into his brain.
Okay.
And there we'll leave it.
And on that bombshell, on a tightrope, suspended above a chasm, we'll leave it and come back next time to find out both what happens at the very, very end of part 1 of the Sunbird, and then what happens in the whole of part 2.
Yes. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Tom Harper.
And it's goodbye from me, Diana Thomas.
That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne. Music by Dewey DeLay. Executive producer, Niso Smith.